Okay.
Sí, Natalia. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. Es un gusto estar aquí compartiendo con Natalia Kovrinchik. Vamos a tener una charla informativa sobre los programas de doctorados en Estados Unidos, pero con énfasis en la Universidad del Estado de Arizona. Y el objetivo de la charla es conocer sobre estos doctorados en Estados Unidos, en especial en la Universidad del Estado de Arizona, que es donde nuestra expositora se encuentra actualmente a cargo de las admisiones de doctorado. Y para tener un poco idea de quién es la expositora de hoy, les puedo comentar que Natalia es profesora asociada de Economía de la W.P. Carey School of Business de la Universidad del Estado de Arizona. Tiene una amplia formación académica, tiene una licenciatura y una maestría en matemáticas y en matemáticas aplicadas y ciencias de la computación, pero también tiene una maestría en economía y un PhD, un doctorado en economía de la Universidad de Chicago. Ella ha trabajado investigado en distintos temas, sobre todo en el tema de contratos bajo condiciones complejas y en aplicaciones tales como préstamos de consumo corporativos, calificación crediticia, gestión de activos, y tiene publicaciones en muchas revistas académicas importantes como el American Economic Review, el Journal of Political Economy, la Review of Financial Studies y el Journal of Economic Theory. Así que para nosotros es un gran gusto tener a una invitada tan calificada como Natalia. It's our pleasure to have you here, and it's yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the detailed introduction. I actually understood, I think, pretty much what you were talking about because it was about me. Now, I do apologize for not being able to speak in your native language, so you would have to tolerate my English with a Russian accent, but that's what I got. What it is that I want to tell you is pretty much here. So I kind of want to share with you some information about applying to PhD programs from the insider's perspective. What do I mean by that? I'm a director of graduate studies, which means one of my jobs is I am in charge of PhD admissions. So I want to tell you kind of how we from the inside as the committee look at applications, and hopefully give you some information that you may not know. So here's what I plan to talk about. I will start with general information and I will try to answer the following 4 questions. The first one is what? What is PhD in economics? The second one is why? Why do PhD in economics? The third one is where to apply to, how to choose where to apply to. And lastly, I will talk about how to apply. So what is important in the application, and this would be applicable if you're applying this year or if you're just thinking about applying. I'll also try to tell you what you can do already now so that to strengthen your application when the time comes. Okay. Now, as much as I'm happy to share general information with you, I do have hidden agenda in mind, which is that I want to attract you to ASU and want to make sure that ASU is on the set of schools that you are considering. And so I will tell you what is special about ASU and why I think you should consider it when applying to PhD programs. Okay. So I'm here for you guys. Please don't hesitate to interrupt me at any point in time if you have questions. It's supposed to be a discussion. All right. So what is PhD in economics? Now, to clarify, I'm only talking about PhD in the United States because that's just what I'm most familiar with. And I'm sure that things work a little bit differently in other countries in the world. So a typical PhD program in the United States is a 5-year program. Sometimes the funding gets extended to 6 years, more so in the recent years. A typical PhD program will offer you full financial support, which means the university will pay for your tuition, the cost of your education. You will receive a stipend. This is the money that you will live on. And also the university will cover the cost of your medical insurance. Not all programs, but most programs require you to work either as a teaching or a research assistant. This is nothing to worry about. It's typically not a lot of time. You can apply either with a bachelor's or a master's degree. Traditionally, international students are applying with a master's degree, but we're seeing the change of that, and more people go straight from the bachelor's degree, just because they kind of, the process became more transparent and people understand they don't need a master's degree, okay? So what do you do as a PhD student? For the first 2 years, you take courses. So in the first year, those are mandatory courses in microeconomics, macroeconomics, and econometrics. At ASU, we also teach a mathematics for economists course. And then after the first year, you take qualifying exams, which you have 2 attempts to pass. If you don't pass them, you have an option of receiving the master's degree. If you pass, you continue with your studies. In the second year, you continue to take courses, but those are going to be elective courses, so more kind of narrower fields, such as, let's say, labor economics or public economics or economic theory. And those are meant to start preparing you for independent research. They will have, let's say, research proposals as part of the course requirement. And so this is starting from your second year is when you start doing independent research, and you will continue to do that until you graduate and until you find your job. Okay, so what are the typical jobs upon graduation? Now, most students go into research-oriented jobs. Those could be jobs in academia. So you could be a professor at a university. Assistant professor just means it's an entry position to a tenure track. Or there could be research jobs in, let's say, government sector. You could be an economist at a central bank. Or it could be Federal Reserve Bank, World Bank, IMF. So there are some organizations that are not academic, but you still do research. Now, for most people, industry jobs are kind of a plan B. So they go there if they cannot find an academic job. Not always true. Sometimes people actually prefer to go into the industry. So if they do, they get very nicely paid positions in the private sector. I do want to stress once again is that this is not really the target jobs for most students. So most students target research-oriented jobs. So this brings me to my next slide, how to decide if PhD in economics is for you. Why do PhD in economics? So the answer to this question is purposefully short, if you want to do research. So if you are not excited about research, there are other things you can do if you want to do kind of more policy-oriented work. There's their PhD in public policy. If you're interested in business, there are MBA programs. In the PhD in economics, your life in the 5 years is going to be about writing papers. So if you're not really up for that, it's going to be kind of a miserable 5 years because it's just so research-oriented environment. Okay. All right, so how to choose where to apply to. Students often ask me, are rankings important? So the short answer is yes, but if you're only looking at rankings, you're doing it wrong. There's just a lot of other things that may not be reflected in rankings that are important, and there's a lot more detailed information that is needed to make the decision where to apply or where to go to once you have offers. So before I explain what those things are, let me talk a little bit about rankings since I've mentioned them. So the two most widely used ones are US News and Ideas. So US News, what you should be looking at or looking for is best economics graduate schools. US News publishes other rankings as well, including by field. So these rankings are going to be based on surveys. So these are peer assessment surveys that are sent to academics, okay? The second ranking is Ideas. Again, Ideas publishes a lot of rankings, including, for example, economic journals. And notice here, there's a word US. So Ideas publishes rankings of economics department around the world. I just mentioned the US ones, but you can go and look for the best school, for example, in Costa Rica. So those are pretty useful. Now, these are going to be based on publications. Okay. Now, what other things are important in making a decision in addition to rankings? Before I explain that, let me first tell you where to find those things. And what you need to do is just you go to the web pages of a particular university, you find the economics department, and then there's going to be a link to faculty, and then you go and just look at the web pages of the faculty members. Okay. And basically, how do you assess quality of a particular person, or more generally of a department where that person is a faculty member at? You look at their publications, for example. Okay. And as I said, if you don't know what are the top economic journals are, you just go to ideas and you will see there. Okay, so now if you have in mind what field of interest you want to work in, then you want to make sure that the program you're applying to is strong in that field. Okay, so for example, if you're interested in the field of macroeconomics, you go and look at the faculty who list one of their fields, macroeconomics. Now, keep in mind, if you're interested in something more narrowly defined, such as, let's say, monetary economics, which is a subfield of macro, not all macroeconomists are going to be working in that. So you want to see that it could be the departments that have a lot of macroeconomists, none of them are going to be monetary economists. So you want to make sure that there are sufficiently many people working in your field of interest. You never want to go anywhere because of one person, because what if that person leaves? And you also want to look at the quality of faculty working in that field. And again, the way you assess that is where they got their PhD, or more importantly, where do they publish their work? And also for you, whether what they're working on is related to your more narrower interest, so that you can potentially see yourself working under their supervision. Okay. Also, you could have an idea of what you're interested in, but in practice, when you go to a particular program, you take classes, you talk to people, the field of interest changes. Okay. It could also be that you have no idea what your field of interest is, which is perfectly fine. You have broad interests. So for both of these reasons, it's a good idea to go to a department which is broad across different fields. Also, keep in mind that first and foremost of all, you're not a labor economist, you're not a macroeconomist, you're not an economic theorist, you're an economist. So you want to be educated in a program which gives sort of a well-rounded education and well-rounded perspective on questions, on economic questions. Okay. A very important parameter to look at is placements. So what does this mean? These are the jobs that graduates get. Those are pretty much always published online. You can just go and look for PhD placements. And my suggestion is to not only look at top placements, but look at all placements. Keep in mind, there's a difference between being a top student at a program, let's say we're at a top program, and being a median student at a top program. There's also a difference between being a median student at a top program and being the best student at maybe a low ranked program. So if your advisor writes something like, this is the best student I've had in the last 10 years, even if you're coming from a lower ranked program, you will definitely receive attention from potential employers. So there's basically, a lot of programs to apply to. And I think really the most important thing is to find the one that is a good match for you. One more aspect that is important is how accessible faculty is. Again, kind of circling back to, let's say, top programs, it often happens that in large programs, such as top programs, not all students get a lot of attention from faculty. So I'll later mention how this works at ASU, but this is mostly, you can learn this from just conversation with your advisors, with people in those programs. But that's something that is important to take into account, especially if you feel like you need a lot of kind of, hands-on advice on presentations on your work, and you kind of need frequent interaction with your advisor. Okay, so the next slide is going to be perhaps the most useful for you guys, and so I invite any questions that you might have. I want to mention here, which applies to my whole presentation, of course, I'm only one person. So I'm giving you my experience, the way we do things here. It's possible that it's done slightly differently in other programs. So please take this as just my opinion, okay? Excuse me. So the first thing I want to mention is that while there's several things that are important in your package, at least here, we don't really have any thresholds on each particular of these aspects of the application. Really, what we do is that we look at your whole portfolio, and then we see kind of that whole package, as opposed to really see, oh, you're just not good enough along this dimension, we're not going to look at you. Okay, so if you're lacking along one dimension, it's just important that you overcompensate or compensate along another dimension. Okay, so please keep that in mind. Now, the way the four things that I mentioned here are really three, the first three, they're not really here in the order of importance. They're just, I ordered them in the order in which it is more convenient for me to talk about. And so I will mention as I go, which are more important and which are less important. Okay. So grades are generally important. So we look at GPA, which is grade point average. It just means, I mean, every school has them. It's just an average of all of the grades that you got, and those going to be both for your undergraduate degree as well as for the master's degree. So you're gonna submit a transcript for the undergraduate degree, or if you're doing a master's degree, you're also going to be submitting a separate transcript for that. And so what we look at is grades, and more specifically, the courses that interest us are going to be in economics and mathematics. Okay, so mathematics is very important. You know, mathematics is the language of modern economics. So you want to have a strong mathematical background. Keep in mind, we understand we're not admitting you to a PhD program in mathematics. So we're not expecting anything, very high level from you. But some courses, in sort of in mathematical analysis and real analysis, anything proof-based, some algebra, ideally some courses in probability theory and statistics. So those would all be useful. Now, if you're lacking in terms of the math courses, there are two things you can do. First, as I said, you just need to compensate it along another dimension. You can try to show your preparation in math in different ways, and I will mention one of them is going to be GRE, another one is could be your thesis, but also it's a good idea to take additional mathematical courses if you feel like your mathematical background is lacking a little bit. Now, even if you're taking them late and perhaps your grade is not going to be known, still, if you write in your personal statement that you're taking these additional mathematics courses, what you're indicating is A, that mathematics is important. I'll answer your question in just a second. First, that mathematics is important, and second, that you took steps to take some math courses. What is the recommended average GPA for applying to PhD programs? Is there like a rule of thumb? It's tricky, not really. So keep in mind, there's a lot of differences across different countries and across different institutions. So I would say in the US, the maximum is 4. So you should try for your GPA to be well above 3. If it's lower than 3, it will be considered low. I would say ideally above 3.5. But again, it's not like if your GPA is lower than that, we're not going to look at your application. So it's not the GPA itself that matters, but rather what courses you took. So I will be looking at what mathematics courses you took, what grades you have there, and also the important economics courses you took. Does that make sense? Also, it could be that, let's say if your undergraduate GPA is a little bit lower and you're in a master's program and your master's GPA is higher, that will definitely be considered a good signal. Also, if there's anything wrong with your transcript, by that I mean there's some grades that are low, but you have a good explanation for why that's the case, or maybe you just weren't very serious about studies, you're kind of fooling around, but then you realize that economics is really what you want to study, and then your GPA went up. All of these things is a good idea to explain them. Whoops, wrong place. Good idea to explain them in your personal statement. Okay, that's what the personal statement is in part for, to explain these things. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Of course. All right. In general, when you decide what courses to take in the future, it's a good idea to, if you have sort of choices, it's a good idea to take more advanced courses, more challenging courses. It looks better on your transcript. Also, keep in mind that you might be asking the instructors that teach these courses for the recommendation letter. So I'll talk about this more when I talk about the letters of recommendation, but it's always a good idea to discuss with the people whom you're thinking of taking classes from or already taken classes from about your interest in applying to PhD. They can always, at the very minimum, they can give you, at the very minimum, they will just know, they will look at you kind of differently with the understanding in mind that you might ask them for a letter of recommendation. And they will also give you advice, they will suggest whom to talk to, etc. So definitely let them know, okay? So the second point here are Gre scores. Okay, so these are tricky. This is something that you probably have the most control over, sort of. My suggestion is to prepare for those, for the tests for at least 3 to 4 weeks. Don't just go and try to take them and see what happens. Keep in mind that, okay, 2 things. First of all, the results are good for 5 years. So if you're thinking about applying, let's say next year, you can take your GRE earlier. Also, if you are taking the GRE tests if you're taking them twice, let's say, or multiple times, keep in mind that whomever you send the scores to will see your previous scores. So, which also contain information. So those are just not free attempts. Those results are going to be revealed. Now, the score that we look at the most is the quantitative score, and it does matter. It's something we pay attention to. What does it mean to have a high quantitative score? So the maximum is 170. At top schools, it's very competitive, and I know they look at these scores. Now, at our program, anything above 168, we would consider a high score, and I'm, sort of, kind of depends on whom you ask. 167 is an okay score. 166 and below, kind of that's something that starts making me nervous. Now, having said that, as I said, we don't have any cutoffs. So we have accepted applicants with, or this an applicant with, I think her score was 161. She's from Lebanon. Now, she had, one of her majors was in mathematics. So I was pretty sure she knows math. And her quantitative score was, some kind of, I don't know, bad accident. So later, what I've learned, I'm sorry, what I've learned is that, she didn't really know what to expect. She's not used to multiple choice questions, and it just wasn't very sort of typical for her an exam to take. Now, why am I telling you this story? So that you know what to expect. So it's very important to practice as much as you can. there's nothing hard in that quantitative test. They're not going to ask you to take an integral or to take some complicated maximization problem. It's going to be basic math and basic logic, but you need to basically be acquainted with the type of questions that they ask, and you need to do them, most importantly, really fast, well, and correctly, obviously. So the only way how you can achieve that is with a lot of practice. So definitely worth it, definitely pay a lot of attention to this and try to do as well as you can. There's also a verbal score for applicants for whom English is not a native language. We don't really pay that much attention to it. Having said that, if you do well on the verbal score, it's going to be considered a plus. If you don't do well, it's not going to be considered a minus. Okay, so there's also a Toefl test that all non-native speakers need to take, or rather all born not in English speaking countries, to be more precise. And those are, so there is some university, at least here, there's some university requirement for kind of the lower bound of what that test need to be. Once you clear that bound, I personally don't even look at the Toefl score. Why? The reason is only one, because all the candidates who were potentially considering to admit, we interview them. And in that 15-minute interview or 20-minute interview, I will be able to assess the level of your English, you know, to the degree that I feel like would be satisfactory for you to understand, you know, to understand classes, etc. Okay, so English is important, but the Toefl test itself is not terribly important. Okay, here at ASU. This keeps jumping, I'm sorry. All right, so the third item on the list, letters of recommendation. This is perhaps the most important of all three, and often this is the first thing that I look at in the package. So for those of you who don't know, so you're asked to submit typically 3 letters of recommendation. Who should you ask? Your academic advisors or your instructors. Now, I put this in italic more kind of as a note for myself. Those, by academic, I don't mean, even though that's what it says, I don't mean necessarily from the university. If you have, let's say, an RA job at, let's say, Central Bank, those are also going to be basically at the same level as your advisors at your university. Whom you shouldn't be asking are your bosses at a job which is not in any way related to research. Why? Because there's nothing they can tell us about your research potential. They can say something about your social skills, etc., but your academic advisors will know that they need to write about that, and they will write about it. Okay, so basically what we need to know, or what we have uncertainty about, are 2 things: your preparation and your research potential. Your preparation is much easier to figure out. We can figure this out from your transcripts, from the courses you took, from the grades you got, partly from your Gre score, although that's very noisy, as well as what school you're from, kind of what, you know, whether you have a master's degree. So there are a lot of things. The research potential is really, really hard to figure out. It's hard to figure out by your advisors. We will not know what your research potential until maybe your 3rd year or so. But as of now, your advisors have the most knowledge about it. Okay, so the first person whom you should be asking is your thesis advisor. It could be, now, the most important of the things that qualify someone to be your letter writer, they need to know you well. The better they know you, the more informative letter they can write. Now, it could be that you just don't have enough people who know you really well. What does this imply? When you're thinking about asking someone who you took a class from, it's important that those people know more than just, let's say, the grade that you got. Okay, if all they can say is that this person took my class, he or she's in the, let's say, 80th percentile of the class and got a grade A, I could have kind of learned most of it from your transcript. So if you're thinking about asking this person for a letter of recommendation, what should you do? You should be active in the class. What does this mean? Ask questions, have discussions, go talk to that professor. First of all, as I mentioned before, tell them you're interested in applying for PhD. Tell them about your research interests, what you're thinking about. If you're working on a thesis, tell them about that. So they can write a more informative letter, okay? So this one is tricky and requires an explanation. So it's a plus, although not necessary if your letter writer studied in the US or they routinely write recommendation letters. Okay, so what do I mean by that? And by the way, this doesn't have to be the US. The reason I put this is just because, it could be just basically programs that are well known, be that in the US or in Europe or in Latin America or wherever, okay? Programs that people mostly know about. Okay, now let me explain why that's important. I'll give you an example. Here is a very informative letter. For example, Alberto Vindas, if he writes a letter, I got my PhD from ASU, this person whom I'm writing for would be at the top of my ASU class. For me, that's very informative. It doesn't have to be ASU, it could be other programs in the US that I more or less can assess the level of, okay? Also, even if your advisor didn't study in the US, it's very useful if they routinely write recommendation letters. So, give you another example of a very informative letter. Someone writing the following: I have written recommendation letters for students A, B, C, and D who have been admitted to programs or are currently attending programs at universities E, F, G, H. This other student, the student A, let's say, he or she has already graduated and now is an assistant professor at the University X. Now, the student whom I'm recommending is roughly at the same level as students B and C, maybe slightly below student A and slightly above student D. So to me, this is a very informative letter. Now, I understand, of course, and so does your letter writer, that they're basing this ranking on what they know, which is a very limited information, but it's still more than what I've got. So now, what does this mean for you? If you know letter writers that write letters like this, it's a good idea to get one, provided that they know you well. Everything else equal, I would take a letter of recommendation from a person who can write more about you. But, basically, even if they don't write any of these comparisons, if they can write about your thesis, if they can write about how excited you're about economics and all of things like this, this is a lot of information, okay? Sometimes people ask how well known your letter writer is. Is that important? Yes and no. Really, what's important is that they know you well. So if they know you well, it's helpful. It gives me an idea that they have experience. They know what they're talking about. They probably know what it takes to get a PhD, to study in the PhD program in the US. Now, if they don't know you well, the fact that they have a lot of publications is not going to rub off in any way on your application. Okay. Now, again, so this is perhaps the most important one. There is a personal statement which you have together with your application. Now, this is not really assessed on its own. So when I delegate assessment of files to my colleagues, and they report it back to me, they say, let's say, high GPA, okay Gre score, strong recommendation letters, one from a person whom I know and trust. They will not write strong personal statement or weird personal statement. It's just not a thing. Nobody assesses your personal statement on its own. So what you should use your personal statement for, and let me maybe click here. Keep in mind, I'm not going to read your master's thesis or your bachelor's thesis just because it's a lot of stuff to read, not because I don't think it's important, but you can tell about your thesis, and you should tell about it in your personal statement. It's important to do this in a very structured way, sort of, here's the topic I'm working on, some short motivation, here's the methodology I'm using, here are the results that I found, okay? So if you can show that you can write well in a structured way, that's definitely going to be a plus. You shouldn't be writing about your story of life that, sometimes people write, I was born in a family of a teacher and an accountant, so I was exposed to economics from the age of 2. It's cute. It's not really informative. Okay, so write things that are actually relevant as opposed to those things that are kind of pretty to read. Write about why economics excites you. Write why research excites you. Write why you want to do a PhD in economics. It tells me that you know what PhD is about, you know what it takes, you know that research is important, and hopefully you will be able to transmit your excitement about economics. As I've mentioned, you want to have a brief description, meaning maybe a paragraph or 2 of your thesis, or more general about your research interests. It's also very okay to be kind of broad in your interests. Very important, you want to write a separate personal statement for each of the programs that you're applying to. It doesn't mean your whole thing is going to be different. It's just, typically it's the last paragraph, but you want to do research on a particular program, and you want to explain why this program is a good match for you. So try to dig deeper than what's just on the website. You can, go to faculty web pages, as I've already mentioned. You want to do this anyway, because it's important for you to figure out if this is the right program. And once you've done all that work, then you want to write in your personal statement what you found out. Let's say if you're interested in macro, you're applying to this program where there are these particular faculty that are working in macro whose research is closest to your interest, and something like this, okay? So that's really important. Also, if there are any issues in your application, such as I've mentioned, some low grades that you have a good explanation for. It could be that you're applying with your partner and it's really important for you to be in the same city or in the same program. So all of things like this may appear or might be useful to put in your personal statement. Okay. Now, what are some things that are not really important or could even be detrimental? One of these is a non-research related work experience. I know people often think, okay, especially if you're in sort of a, have financial hardship, people think I'm going to apply for jobs, maybe work for a few years, and then go to PhD. It's fine, but keep in mind that this could be considered a negative in your application once you actually decide to apply. And by the way, this is not applicable to research-oriented jobs, for example, at a central bank where you work as a analyst or research assistant, where your job is directly related to doing research. Okay, so those are going to be non-research. Non-research are the keywords here. Okay, so now why is this considered a negative? For 2 reasons. The first one is the more time passes since you've taken classes, the harder it is to kind of get back into studying, and also you just simply forget what you've studied. So your knowledge, as any capital, human capital, sort of depreciates. Okay. The second thing is you sort of appear unfocused. You appear as if you don't really know what you want to do. You've tried doing this, then you did a little bit of that you sort of didn't like this, then you decided to apply to PhD. So it makes me worried that maybe PhD is going to be one of those things. Now, if you do have such a gap sort of in your CV, going back, this is something you will want to explain in your personal statement. Okay, why this is happening, or why has this happened? Okay, publications are typically not important. Perhaps unless they are in international journals, in which case they could be a positive if they're in sufficiently good journals, but definitely not a requirement, and it will not be considered a minus if you don't have any publications. Same goes for teaching experience. You should definitely write that you were a teaching assistant for such and such in your resume, but it's, being an instructor or being a TA is just not particularly important. Also, I wouldn't stress teaching too much in your personal statement. It's definitely true that teaching is part of the job of a professor. It's not the main part of the job. The main part of the job is research. So if you say that I really like teaching and this is why I'm doing PhD, I want to do PhD that because I want to teach, that makes me nervous. It makes me nervous because I think maybe you don't understand that research is going to be your primary, research is going to be your primary activity, and research is really going to be what you will be evaluated on as opposed to teaching. Okay. Any questions? I'm basically wrapped up with my general part of the presentation. And so unless there are any questions, let me tell you about ASU. So here's a picture of our beautiful campus. This is the new business school building. There's a gym there, and the perspective from which you're looking at it, this is where the economics department is roughly. Okay, so ASU is, the Department of Economics at ASU is kind of up and coming place. People didn't really know much about ASU, I want to say, till maybe 20 years ago. And then since then, this department was improving along several dimensions. So currently, ASU economics is ranked around 30 by ideas. I think last time I checked, it was 31. Before that, it was 30, so it's fluctuating a little bit. Importantly, we're ranked ahead of such well-known universities as University of Minnesota, Rochester, NYU Stern, and Carnegie Mellon. This is a home of the Nobel Prize winner in economics Ed Prescott, whose main research interest is macroeconomics. Now, Ed has a center here, which is very important for both students and faculty. For students, it provides some additional sources of stipends. So there is a fellowship that is associated with that center. It also hosts visitors. Right now, we have a visitor who's hosted by the Ed Prescott Center. He's here for several days. So this is very important exposure for both faculty and students. Also organizes conferences. In general, ASU is kind of known for organizing several conferences in different fields. This, kind of got paused somewhat during COVID, although we had some of the virtual conferences. Now we're starting back, kind of going back to having in-person conferences. Now, as I've mentioned before, this is kind of an up and coming place. So the quality has been steadily improving, which is reflected in improvement of rankings that I've mentioned, improvement of PhD placements, in the quality of students that I've mentioned in a little bit, and also publications of faculty. So in particular, our junior faculties is, if not all, then almost all of them have either a publication in a top 5 journal or a revision request from the top 5 journal. So we have a pretty impressive group here. ASU is strong in a variety of fields. Traditionally, this place has been strong in macro, with Ed Prescott being here, as well as in theory. So in theory, for the department of our rank, we have a very large as well as a very strong group in economic theory. When I came here in 2008, we pretty much didn't have an applied microfield. The only person here was Michael Keane, who's great, but he was half here, half in Australia. So since then, we built a very impressive applied microfield. And I would say maybe 45% of our students, give or take, are now specializing in the field of applied micro, broadly defined. Other sort of narrower fields that we have here include labor, both from the applied micro as well as from the macro perspective. financial economics, now IO. We now have a person in IO. What else did I not mention? So environmental is kind of a separate almost field for us. This is kind of, we have people from both applied micro as well as my neighbor Steffi is a macroeconomist who is interested in environmental economics. Now, as you know, environmental economics is just a very kind of vibrant, and I don't know, everybody cares about this. Everybody, that's all I read now in the news, ESG investment, how to basically go net zero by 20, whatever is your, year of choice, 2050 or 2030. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, our history with the environmental economics field is that our president was determined to build the field of environmental economics. So we got separate hiring lines just for that. We were very picky. It took us a while to build a group, but now this is one of the probably strongest group in the country. Okay. Now, importantly, this is a small program. Currently, the incoming class is about 10 to 12 students. Now, this hasn't always been this way. We used to have a larger class. Several years ago, we have decided to admit fewer students with only one reason, because we wanted to be more competitive in terms of the stipend that we give to these students. So what's interesting is that despite the incoming class being smaller, the size of the graduating class didn't really change much. So because we're paying more, we're more competitive, we're able to admit high quality students, which are less likely to fail the qualifying exams, less likely to leave the program just for the reasons that they figure out economics is not for them. And yeah, so we're doing, we're pretty happy with the class size. Now, it also gives the advantage to student of having a lot of faculty per student, or having fewer students per faculty, which means a lot of attention to students. And I mean, I know what I'm comparing this to. At Chicago, we just didn't have that much attention from faculty. In particular, if you're at the top, you will always get attention once you kind of start, as at the top of your class. Once you kind of get closer to the median and down, the attention kind of naturally shrinks in top programs. Not really the case here, just because we have a lot of faculty, and we also, as a department, which is kind of, always aiming up, always improving, we understand that placements of our students is, our bread and butter. It's very essential for the improvement of this department. So we spend a lot of attention with students in terms of advising. Many, or not many, but more so than before, students are co-authoring with faculty members. I think Alberta, in fact, if you're still there, you had a project with Bart and Todd, right?
Yep, still ongoing.
Yes. So, and we see more and more of that happening, which we're very happy about. Also, there's a special class that is taught, also kind of a relatively new introduction, that all students from year 2 and above need to attend. And this is purely about presentations. They still present their work, they get feedback on their work, but more attention is paid to the presentations. So also, I mean, it's a small department, not in terms of the faculty, but in terms of the, I should say, small program. There's not a lot of students, so it's customary for faculty to come to students' talks, even if it's not in their field. Okay, so what does this mean for students? It means that they get feedback from faculty, not only from their committee or from their field, but also across other fields, which again, kind of circling back to what I said before, it's important to be kind of, to get feedback from a lot of different groups, to be a well-rounded economist. When you go in the job market, you're going to be talking to everyone. So you want to make sure that you're first and foremost an economist, that you can talk to a lot of people. Okay. Now, in terms of financial support, we offer full financial support to all students whom we are admitting. So it doesn't happen that you are accepted, but you're in a wait list for funding, which I know happens in other programs. Here, everyone receives at least a basic stipend. I'll mention a little bit more about this in the next bullet point. Now, I wrote here that about half of the students receive 6-year funding. It's actually been more recently because faculty have been more active and more active at applying for grants and more successful at receiving grants, which allows them to hire research assistants and then extend additional funding to students. So we've been seeing a lot more of this recently. Now, as I said, our students receive at least basic stipend. Now, for candidates that we particularly want and really want to attract, there are multiple sources of additional fellowships that we can explore and give. One of those, the sort of, it's called KC, but it's the one that is associated with at Prescott. Those interested in macro, but there are a lot of other ones. We have a special fellowship, a separate fellowship for female candidates. We're very interested in having more females in the program, so please do apply. We have funds, so in particular, we fund such things as data collection for students. If you apply to conference and your paper got accepted, we typically pay for conference trips and kind of other things. I put this again in italic to for myself not to forget. So this is not typical. Most programs who require you to work as a teaching or a research assistant will ask you to do so starting from the first year, not at ASU. At ASU, you do nothing in the first year except for taking your classes. And then starting from your second year is when you are asked to work as a teaching or a research assistant. Okay. Here are just some sample ASU alumni affiliations. If I knew that Alberto was going to be in this presentation, I would have put his affiliation here as well. You can find the full list of placements on our website, but as you can see, we place both in North America as well as across the world, as well as in Latin America. Last year, everyone was nervous during the pandemic because there were a lot fewer positions. We all knew that. So we placed all of our students last year. 6 went to research institutions, 1 got a private sector job. Now, our recent graduates have published in leading journals, including top 5 economic journals, such as the one listed below. And this is pretty much it. So first of all, thank you so much for coming here. I know you have things to do, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. I really hope that you found this presentation useful if you're thinking about applying to PhD programs in the US. I also really hope that you will apply to PhD at ASU when the time comes. There's here some links for more information, but if you just Google economics at Arizona State, you will find us. It's still not late to apply this year. So our application deadline is January 15th. And I want to stress that this is a soft deadline. It doesn't mean that we will not consider applications that come after. But obviously, the sooner you apply, the better. But not all documents absolutely need to be there by January 15th. You can always send just your unofficial Gre Scores. It's kind of important that at least some of your recommendation letters are here by this deadline. But I start looking at documents maybe around end of January or so. Okay. Now, I'm hoping that you guys will have some questions for me, but if you don't have them now, please feel free to mail me. And here's my email address. Now, I forgot to mention, we have the best sunsets, arguably. So it's beautiful. I can tell you more about how it is to be a student, but honestly, with Alberto here, he's probably the best reference. But it's a pretty, it's a very large university. There's a lot of, a lot of things to do, a lot of people to talk to, a lot of infrastructure. People often ask, do I need a car? No, you don't need a car. It's pretty accessible by bike, or there's trams, they're called light rails, etc. The weather here is beautiful, except for 3 months in a year when it's pretty hot. but people often, I mean, unlike in Latin America, from what I hear, or in Russia, where I'm from, there's air conditioning everywhere. So it's very pleasant. So at that, I will wrap up once again. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you, and please feel free to ask me any questions.
Thank you very much. No sé si hay comentarios o preguntas de los compañeros y compañeras que han estado escuchando la charla.
Yo tal vez, don Leonardo, para agregar una cosita más. One thing that I think Natalia didn't mention directly, but that I did experience as a student, was that because of the frequency of conferences and visitors coming to speak to ASU, you also had the chance as a student to talk directly to these visitors. And that is something that I didn't see happening in many other departments, and that helped me a lot into practicing to, well, just tell my ideas and also get feedback, and also like do a little bit more of early networking that I don't think is the norm within the departments.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up. I used to have this on my slides, and then I took it away in the attempt of shortening it, but this is very important. So for students who are, let's say here, 4, 5, and 6, who are preparing to go on the market, they are very frequent. I mean, pretty much every time when there's an external visitor, they get put on their schedule, which means they're like 30-minute meeting where you meet with that speaker. Now, this is not common. At Chicago, this happened to me once when I was put on a schedule of an external speaker. And then strictly speaking, he wasn't even external because he was from Northwestern, which is another university at Chicago, in the city of Chicago. So here it happens frequently. Now with conferences also, all students are obviously invited and encouraged to go to conferences. And ASU has, I would say, between 3 and 5 conferences a year. And these are typically 2-day conferences where you have, I mean, there are presentations, but then there are lunches, there are dinners where you can have basically talk to people informally. Again, at Chicago, now there are more of these things, but I don't really remember going to conferences at Chicago when I was a student. Now there is a Becker Friedman Center, and there's a Fama French Center. So there's a lot more of that stuff. But yes, definitely. Thanks so much, Alberto, for mentioning this. This is really important. And this is, by the way, going back to small program. It's hard. There's nothing wrong with Chicago. You know, you should go there if you're admitted. But this is sort of a luxury of a small PhD program that we can do this for our students.
Hi, good afternoon. Yo tenía una pregunta, no sé si hacerla en inglés o español, era un poco también para el profe, entonces aprovechando que él también estudió ahí.
Tal vez mejor en inglés y después esto se traduce.
I wanted to know if it is recommended to first start with a master intermediate program before getting admitted into the ASU University, or if in the opinion of Professor Pindas, that the mathematical background and the abilities it are already being fomented in the basic BA program. Okay,
this is a great question. The short answer is it depends. It depends on traditionally, historically, Latin American students were more likely to come from with a master's degree. That has been changing. There is no requirement to have a master's degree. So in fact, I believe that the sooner you start the PhD, the better, because basically there's just a lot more time ahead of you. Keep in mind that, let's say for American students, most American students are applying without the master's degree. They go straight to the bachelor's degree. So whom you're going to be sort of not competing against, but basically who your peers are going to be here. A lot of them are not going to have the master's degree. So if you want to, I think even if you want to go to top programs, it might be more beneficial to do a master's degree, but even in that case, it's not really required. It depends on how good your transcript is with your bachelor's degree. I would say if you have good grades, then there's no need to do master's. Also, in terms of math courses, a typical master's program in economics is not going to offer mathematics courses. You can always pick up some extra, but in terms of math background, I mean, if anything, you probably remember your math more when you come straight from the bachelor's degree than after the master's degree. So I think the short answer, it depends. I suggest you to talk to your advisors. You can talk to Alberto because he can assess better kind of your preparation right now, but I would strongly consider applying, at least trying to apply right away.
In my case, well, I did take the master's degree beforehand route, but I also have a bunch of other friends that have fared very, very, very well coming straight from the bachelor's in Costa Rica now. In my case, I do think that it helped me kind of like realize the workload that I would be facing. Because when I started like on day one, I was already running at the speed that needed to be at the program. Well, I sort of realized that some others that didn't have that preparation beforehand kind of like struggle a little bit more. But it doesn't mean that it can't be done. I think it was most like setting the expectations appropriately, but yeah, thinking back, if I could have done that with my bachelor's from Costa Rica, yes, I think I would have managed well as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? And you can also, by the way, you can ask in Spanish and then Alberto can always translate.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Well, I think everybody must be satisfied. I think it was a very interesting.
One in the chat. Sorry, what can I do while finishing my BA to get better chances? So, you know, as I mentioned before, this is really about improving these, you know, things that I've mentioned that are important in the application, and what you can do, definitely prepare for the GRE. This is very important. And try to get good recommendation letters. So by the way, when asking for a recommendation letter, it's perfectly fine to say, you know, I want to apply to PhD, would you write me a good letter? It's sort of understood that if a person cannot write you a good letter, they often just say no, but it's a good idea to ask, and definitely kind of have that networking or have communication with your potential letter writers so that they can write informative letters. Really, the most important thing is your excitement about economics and your research potential. So if you can improve along that dimension, and it doesn't have to be anything concrete. We're not asking you to write a paper that will get a Nobel Prize, but basically convincing or trying to show your letter writers about your excitement about economics. I think that would be something that you can kind of do in a sort of a relatively short period of time, if that makes sense.
I'd also like to add, if you also have a little bit of extra time, take the math courses, but from the math school, because most of the courses that we take in the bachelor's in economics are not proof-based, enough. So that's going to be also a stronger signal.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias a Natalia por esta presentación. Thank you very much. Y creo que además el apoyo de Alberto y algunas de las otras personas que pueden estar en contacto a futuro para buscar estas oportunidades. Y realmente yo creo que hacer estudios de posgrado en otros países hace una diferencia enorme, no solo en la formación académica. Yo creo que la experiencia humana de ir a otro país, de hablar otro idioma, de enfrentarse a gente que viene de distintas culturas, siempre es algo que nos transforma. Así que si lo han pensado, no lo duden. Y si no lo han pensado, lo pueden pensar. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you guys coming.